Hello, all. Welcome to week two. It's been a great week one. I really appreciate the participation and all of the comments and things in the classroom so far. So keep it up. And before, assuming that you're reading this on Monday, make sure that you are checking off all of the criteria for your assignment for week one and so on. Now, to talk a little bit about week two's focus, and one of the things that I wanted to highlight is classroom management, and this is one of my areas of expertise, and I'm one of those go-to people in the building and as well as our intervention schools that we have in our district. I also wrote all of the intervention reflections for students who had committed some type of an offense that warranted in-school suspension. So, and I've been around through several of the different types of behavior plans and things that were mentioned in your text. But I did share several resources with you, and one of those is a book, 50 Ways to Improve Student Behavior. I don't get any money from this book. It's just some really good things to go to when I can't think of anything else. I don't know how to deal with this particular child and so on. So it's worth checking out. Take a look. It may prove useful to you. There are also 3 websites. One talks about motivation, intrinsic versus extrinsic, and connects it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And another, motivating learners. And the third is still talking about ways to motivate students, but it connects to our 21st century skills that we talked about in week one and will continue to talk about over the duration of the course. So some things in reading through the text, Newman explained that, and the quote is, managing a classroom effectively means creating the conditions that facilitate learning. And a second part of that is making many decisions and requires exceptional organizational skills in reference to what our jobs are in the classroom. And so some things I wanted to go through in relation to that. And classroom management is a huge piece. It doesn't matter how great your lesson is, if you can't teach it, it's of no use. And so that's an important thing that you have to learn. And classroom management isn't just about negotiating the students. It's knowing how to delegate time. It's knowing how to have your resources ready. It's knowing how to plan for B, C, D, E. Some days you go through the entire alphabet of what's working, what won't work, and so on. And so I'm just going to talk about some different things within that context. First, when you walk in, it doesn't matter what age student you teach, from pre-K through adults, your definition for behavior and what it means to be a student may be completely different than what that child experiences at home. They could have a completely different definition for organization at home. There are extremes where students are coming from cases where they are the adults. And so for them to have to come and adhere to child rules is almost insulting, and they don't know how to do that anymore. You could have the case of someone coming from a family of hoarders, and you have no idea. Their organization may be the best in their family. There may be no example. Obviously, those are extremes, but you need to be aware because those do exist. Many kids, and this is especially true from my experience in middle school, that individually, if you have a conversation with a child one-on-one, you will find that they are beautiful human beings. There will be exceptions, that one kid that you just are having a hard time finding that positive side, characteristic, anything. But they change based on their environment and based on who else is around. So keep that in mind. My dissertation dealt with why students made certain decisions in a learning environment. So bottom line, just in normal people speak, as I like to say, Why does little Joey behave in my room but walks across to Miss Smith and acts like some type of a demon child? And what we set up in the environment is what controls those decisions. And when I go into planning my lessons as well as my classroom arrangement and materials and everything, I think about the kid who hates school, who hates math when I was a math teacher, who hates technology when I did math in technology, who hates me, thinks my jokes are terrible and I'm the worst person on the planet, all of those things. What do I need to do to reach that child? Because if I can get to that child, then I can get to all the others. And you also want to try and find who's the ringleader. If you have a couple of students where the class dynamic is working against you, find the ringleader. Get the ringleader to your side, and it'll make all the difference. One of the things that was alluded to in the readings and the other resources is we have to be ready. We have to be ready for all events. But how can you do that? And you can't. You have to go with the assumption could happen today that I have no idea. I can't even imagine. Can't even imagine. But some things you can think about that teachers often don't, and it's very obvious. Little things like, what hand does your child or do those students you used to write with? Are they left-handed or are they right-handed? If you put them in a certain seat, that makes it easier for them to take notes or participate. Are they bumping elbows? Are you going to have an issue of he's in my space, she's in my space? Is there room for movement? Meaning for you to move around as well as the students and be able to monitor. Can students collaborate? Is it a time where they shouldn't collaborate? What adjustments do you need to make? I always changed my seating with each unit so that way the kids couldn't get too sick of each other, which happens. And to build collaboration skills and for them to understand you may work in a group this time of people you really don't like, and that's okay. You still have to get the work done. And so there's an important learning curve there in terms of how to manage yourself with others. One thing that will be shared with you on Thursday, I didn't want to overwhelm too much, but I did my welcome address for my students through Bite Slide. And just it's another presentation similar to PowerPoint if you've not used it. And in theory, you should be able to access. If there's an issue, just let me know. But what I do, and something for you to think about as you're creating your management plans for this week, is I set the expectation for how we should treat each other. Not the specifics. If you imagine it's the first day of class, and in the case of like a middle school or high school, and to some extent elementary, students have as many as 6 teachers. They're hearing 6 places to turn in work, 6 places to put their supplies when they come in, 6 places to look for the daily agenda, and so on. That's too much. They're not going to remember, and it's just going to be a waste of time. So I build respect. That's the core of everything that we do from there on out. And what I did was, I went through through my little presentation, and I tried to use humor because I know middle schoolers think no one understands them, and they don't know what's going on, and we're so old we could never possibly know. But I use that to tell them events are going to happen outside this classroom, and you have to work really hard to not bring it into the classroom. And so setting that tone helps establish this is where we're going to work in here. This is a safe environment. This is where work happens. And then what I also did, because my my class that goes with this welcome was actually in a computer lab, and it was almost a digital online classroom. And I used the procedures as a way for them to practice accessing my learning activities, how to submit assignments, and so on. So I had 1, they had to reinforce the procedures. 2, I had documentation that they knew the procedures. And then it was a practical way to save time. I had to teach them how to access my classroom and all the things in it, so I did it while teaching the behaviors. Some other things to think about. No emotional decisions. You will at some point get dragged into the emotional nature of whatever's going on. That's not the time to make a decision about a consequence. Use established procedures and established consequences to avoid any type of unfair treatment or what could be perceived as unfair treatment. The kid that I mentioned earlier that will always drive you crazy, you have to think because he got on my nerves yesterday for something different, that doesn't mean it builds on today just because your frustration has grown. So I always think about, okay, if this is the first time a child had ever gotten into trouble doing this, what consequence would he or she get? And I use that as my baseline to make decisions. Now, if little Johnny had done the same thing yesterday or previously, and we've already had a discussion, that's a different thing. So you need to make sure you're really keeping in communication. Look at the intention behind the behavior. If you, again, we talked earlier, and I shared the link about Maslow's hierarchy. See where they fall in that. See if they're trying to avoid work. Are they deflecting? Are they just, would they prefer to be bad? And I'm doing air quotes if you can't see them. Bad instead of dumb. So sometimes kids would just rather you think they don't want to do it, or they're just deciding not to rather than they can't. A quick story. I had a student who came in around November of a school year. He was in 8th grade and he was already 15. He was counting down the days until March when he turned 16. And he was forced to move back to Georgia. He had been living in Miami with his brother, and who he very proudly told us that his brother was a drug dealer. And as soon as he turned 16, he was going to drop out and go to deal drugs with his brother. At which, and this, by the way, was my very first year of teaching. And so, of course, in my very, just call it like I see it way, informed him how much math would be useful for dealing drugs. So he just really needed to know how to do that. And so just that conversation, he at least started listening to me. And pretty sure was not in any methods book or whatever. Well, I had a school, our school had we did not have a school-wide behavior system, sorry. We had, individual teachers had our own plan, and so I had a system of strikes. And Maslin was off task, and so I gave him a strike, and he got really mad at me and said he was going to put a bomb in my room, which you can imagine. I automatically have to notify administrators and so on, although I knew it was actually a great thing because for the first time, he actually cared enough. This is a kid who didn't care if he got suspended. He good. He can go home, do what he wanted. He didn't care if he got in trouble. He didn't care if he did the work. So for him to have that reaction that he was off task meant that he was starting to care. So it was actually a positive. And I had a discussion with the administrator and his mom and with him and as well. And, and he apologized and all of that. But again, make sure you understand where the behavior is coming from. Another thing, don't confuse academics with behavior. One should not affect the other. Although we know off-task behavior, ineffective time on task, and so on will naturally affect academic outcomes. But just because a student doesn't know how to behave doesn't mean that he's not smart, or vice versa. Keep in communication with the parents. I used Class Dojo. That was one of my favorites. Parents loved it. They could see very clear behaviors. They could see exactly what they needed to do that day. Those of you who are interested in special education, this is a phenomenal thing. You can do an app. It's free. Again, I don't get a commission. It's just something that's really, really good. And I used as competitions between the class for overall percentages and so on. Make sure you build a system of accountability between peers. This is important to having an effective classroom. And at my school, in my history of teaching, we've had, as I mentioned, individual plans. We had assertive discipline. We have school-wide, and now we use the PBIS program, which is tailored to our school in combination with International Baccalaureate. And my middle school is kind of a training ground for district administrators. So the longest an administrator stays is typically 3 to 5 years. And so each group comes in and kind of tweaks what's there. So it's been an interesting progress. And the final note that I have for this week in dealing with classroom management and how important organization on your part is, I want you to think about time, and being a math person, always put things in numbers. So schools have 180 school days. Regardless of how they're broken up, it's 180 school days. Now, if you think 5 minutes each school day, you lose because you don't know where you put your paper, or the video link isn't working, or you need to move someone's seat, or whatever the reason. So 5 minutes for confusion or wasted time. That's 900 minutes gone. That 900 minutes is 15 hours. Assuming your classes are about an hour long, which that's about the standard, that's a loss of about 2 weeks of instruction. Think about that. Think about that as you go through your management plan, and really think about that 5 minutes, and keep that 5 minutes. It's a huge difference. It doesn't seem like much, but 5 minutes could end up being 2 weeks of instruction. Imagine where your students would be if they had 2 weeks less than their counterparts. So, on that note, enjoy your week. Make sure you keep asking questions, and I look forward to seeing you in the classroom.